A warm Durban welcome for the 194 nations attending COP17. And this 17th conference of the parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is all about getting the countries around the world to dance to the same tune. The opening ceremony kicked off with Mexico officially handing over the COP17 presidency to South Africa. Incoming President Maite Nkoana Mashabane said the Durban conference was a decisive moment in global climate negotiations. She reminded delegates that they were in Durban for one purpose: to find a common solution that would secure a safe future for generations to come. President Jacob Zuma said for most people in Africa, climate change was a matter of life and death. He said Africa's vulnerability not only stemmed from climate change impacts, such as the rise in sea level, severe droughts and floods, but Africa was particularly vulnerable because of poverty, which limited its ability to cope with the impact of climate change. Activists warned that carbon emissions were rising despite the global economic crisis, and said they were concerned that developed nations might not rise to the occasion and honor their commitments to take more responsibility to reduce climate change.
This is an African COP. The African continent would require certainty, especially given that they're the most vulnerable in terms of the impact of climate change. We would want certainty about where the support will come from, and that's certainly not on the table right now.
And I think it's important we remember that the first time that the climate talks came to Africa was 10 years ago in Marrakesh in 2001. And at that COP, there was a promise made to the poorest countries on the planet that their most urgent adaptation needs would be fully funded, fully financed by developed countries. 10 years on, that promise has all but been broken. And so it's vital that we don't have another lost decade of adaptation investment 10 years ahead. When we look back on this African COP, we must make sure that history doesn't repeat itself.
Most stakeholders at the Durban conference agree that the world urgently needs to get a grip on rising global emissions, and rich nations have to deliver on their promises of providing $100 billion a year to help poor countries cope with the effects of global change. Renat Al-Kham, CCTV, Durban. On day 3 of the COP17 Climate Change Conference in Durban, Team South Africa said everything was on track with regard to the logistics and substance of the talks. But many delegates said proceedings were still dominated by talk that Canada had indicated it would pull out of the Kyoto Protocol, which is widely regarded as the cornerstone of the climate change regime. African delegates said they were also disappointed and frustrated that Japan had not changed its stance since the Cancun talks and would not sign up for a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol.
It's a very frustrating situation, as I said, to say the least. Canada, and I can add Japan, are very key strategic partners of Africa. And when we see them, when we hear them not joining us on addressing that most threatening issue, to say the least, it's discomforting to say the least. This is very uncomfortable. And this is a call again to Canada and Japan to reconsider their position.
We were obviously extremely disappointed to hear Canada's intentions to formally withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol. Canada used to be a leader on climate change. We had a central role in getting the Kyoto Protocol passed and ratified, and so we're obviously really upset to see that this government is moving ahead to abandon their international commitments to this protocol. Unfortunately, we have a government right now whose main climate and energy policy is the promotion of Canada's tar sands. Tar sands are one of the dirtiest fuels that are produced in large quantities in the world, and our government is dead set on rapidly exploiting and expanding this resource, and as a result they have failed to put in place any meaningful regulations on tar sands, which are Canada's fastest growing source of greenhouse gas pollution.
Greenpeace said it was ironic that a nation such as Canada, which had supported South Africa during its struggle for liberation, was not prepared to back the African continent in its latest struggle, the battle against climate change.
It's crunch time for the Kyoto Protocol in South Africa during COP17. So these negotiations will determine whether this protocol lives or dies. And Greenpeace Africa is seriously calling for the fact that a second commitment period must be decided on in these negotiations, together with a mandate for a legally binding instrument. And another key issue that needs to be decided in Durban is where is the money going to come from for vulnerable countries to adapt to climate change.
Africa's chief negotiator said that more than 850 million African people lived with the reality of climate change every day. And he stressed that a global effort was urgently needed to help the people of this continent adapt to and cope with the devastating effects of climate change. Renat Al-Kham, CCTV, Durban. African nations are amongst the lightest polluters in the world, but high rates of poverty, a high dependence on climate-sensitive agriculture for food, and a high population growth rate all make it particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change. Deforestation is also likely to aggravate Africa's vulnerability, especially in respect of water supplies. And as the hottest continent, Africa is expected to suffer the most. Environmentalists say an increase in global temperatures could lead to more catastrophic events such as droughts, storms, flash floods, and rising sea levels.
Already, many in Africa, and particularly women and children, are bearing the brunt of climate change. The impacts are extreme, droughts, and particularly with agriculture, food security. And what we've seen is devastation.
Olonana Ole Pule of the Maasai tribe in Kenya says he came to the COP17 climate change talks to empower himself with knowledge he hopes to pass on to his people back home.
Actually, the conference COP17 is very important to our people. For one reason, the information which will be gathered here, I'll take back to our people on due to climate change, because already here in Kenya, the drought has been affecting us so much, especially the Maasai people.
Egyptian activist Sarah Rifat, also a delegate at the COP17 talks, said the time for developed nations to help Africa to adapt and to buffer communities from the worst ravages of climate change is now.
I'm from Northern Africa, I'm from Egypt, so already the coastal areas are threatened, coral reefs are also threatened in the Red Sea. So yeah, Africa is impacted in very massive ways, and these impacts have already happened.
The scientists have blamed global warming and climate change on the world's major powers, who have historically been the highest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. And developing countries and environmental activists are demanding what they call climate justice for Africa.
My message to my colleagues in developed countries is, particularly at this time, particularly at the time when there are increasing pressures on the global economy, there needs to be boldness and leadership. Unlocking the Green Climate Fund will help to spur growth and jobs across the world, not just in developing countries, but across the world.
When it comes to climate change finance, there's no doubt that the sooner it reaches Africa, the better. Right now, the continent needs around $100 billion a year to combat climate change. But so far, the money that's been made available is less than 10% of Africa's needs. Renat Al-Kham, CCTV, Durban. There was a strong police presence as civil society protesters made their way through the streets of the COP17 host city.
More now! More now! More now!
More economic, energy and climate justice. but lower carbon emissions from the world's wealthy developed nations. That's what thousands of environmental activists were calling for.
We are going in front of the ICC, in front of the bourgeoisie.
The protesters, which included organised labour and civil society organisations such as Greenpeace and other climate change campaigners, went to the Durban International Convention Centre, the seat of the COP17 talks. Some speakers at the march claimed that Durban was a crime scene at the moment because the biggest polluters were in town to waste time instead of listening to the demands of the people.
We want action. We want action now to save our climate, to save our earth, to save the future generation, to demand food security for our country.
Accepting a memorandum from protesters, the COP17 president gave the assurance that she and her colleagues would give their demands the attention it deserved. She said she believed that civil society played an important role in the climate change negotiations and vowed that the process would be a transparent, inclusive one on her watch.
Majority of the delegations in this conference are saying Green Climate Fund now, and it must be operationalized in this conference. Majority of the delegates here are saying second commitment period now, and that should also look at elements of the legal form or the future framework. So whatever we do, we will do also informed by this petition.
We would like the Kyoto Protocol to survive, because otherwise we wouldn't have any binding emission cuts, and it would be all voluntarily, meaning nobody of the states will do anything voluntarily. You know, they don't really want to do anything because it would mean investing money.
The Africa bloc has to hold out so that South Africa stands united against the EU, against the US. That's critical.
And we're here to liberate Mother Earth. We're here to liberate the soil. We're here to liberate the trees. But most important, liberate our mindset. We have to reevaluate our relationship to the sacred of Mother Earth.
Protesters here say they want governments as well as the United Nations COP presidency to listen to the voices of the thousands of people on the streets here in Durban and hear the voices of millions of people around the world who are crying out for climate change. Renat Al-Kam, CCTV, Durban.
One MSC was telling me, Minister, that a week.
The second week of the climate change talks in Durban kicked off with a protest by environmental lobby group Greenpeace. 7 activists were arrested during this action at a local hotel, where they called on COP17 negotiators to listen to the people instead of the world's big polluters. And at a media conference at the Durban International Convention Centre, UN climate change officials insisted that the Kyoto Protocol was alive and well, and said there were several decisions on the table that were ready to be adopted.
Durban can take 2 central and decisive steps to make the world more climate resilient and to put it on the low carbon path. On one set of tasks that we need to look at relates to how governments will work together to achieve their common goal of limiting the global temperature rise to a level which can prevent the worst ravages of climate change. This means answering the very important question of the future of Kyoto Protocol and agreeing on the future discussions moving forward to a future multilateral rule-based system on reducing greenhouse gases emissions. The other major decisive steps, or a basket of tasks, relates to completing that which was agreed upon last year at the UN Climate Change Conference in Cancun.
The COP president said negotiators had also held robust discussions on the Green Climate Fund in the past week. She said this fund was crucial for the financial support of adaptation and mitigation in developing countries to begin in earnest, and said that it would be launched in Durban. She said the United Nations was positive about China's statement that it insists on a second commitment period of the Kyoto Protocol, the only treaty which holds the world's nations accountable for cutting greenhouse carbon emissions.
And I think China here is beginning to answer the question of the how do we sign up on the second commitment period. No, this is not the end. It is China laying the cards on the table, and I'm sure other negotiators will also be laying their cards on the table, and real work then gets escalated. And that's what makes us hopeful that we are moving towards the right kind of direction.
Civil society organization Action Aid praised China for calling on rich countries to meet their existing commitments before a new climate change treaty could be reached. They said China had shown more ambition in slashing its emissions than most other countries. But they slammed the United States, saying that if the US did not want to step up to the plate on the issue of climate change, then it had to move aside and stop holding the rest of the world to ransom.
Then with great pain and with great discomfort, we are saying to President Obama and the US delegation, move aside. Move aside and let the rest of the world move forward if you cannot get with the program. You have delayed the world far too long, and as the largest per capita emitter in the world and as the largest, as a country that carries the biggest responsibility historically, we expect more.
The high-level segment of the climate change conference starts on Tuesday, with 12 heads of state and government and 130 ministers expected to start their round of talks in Durban. And with less than a week left to hammer out crucial decisions and deals on climate change, the pressure is on. Renad Al-Kam, CCTV, Durban. The high-level segment of the Durban Climate Change Conference got underway with a special welcome for the more than 100 ministers and 12 heads of state, who now have the task of working on balanced, fair and credible solutions for a future climate change regime. UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon said global economic problems meant that it may not be realistic to expect a legally binding outcome in Durban. But he urged climate change negotiators and political leaders to keep up their momentum in their crucial discussions over the next few days.
Without exaggeration, we can say the future of our planet is at stake. People's lives, the health of global economy, the very survival of some nations. The science is clear. The World Meteorological Organization has reported that carbon emissions are at their highest in history and rising. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, tells us unequivocally that greenhouse gas emissions must be reduced by half by 2050 if we are to keep the rise in global temperature to 2 degrees since pre-industrial times. According to the International Energy Agency, we are nearing the point of no return, and we must pull back from abyss.
President Jacob Zuma called on leaders to forego their national interests in the interest of humanity.
The world is looking at us and is looking at us with hope that we'll be able to take decisions that will help save the globe for ourselves and for coming generations. I certainly wish the parties well during this final push towards a meaningful outcome in Durban.
Speaking on behalf of the bloc of developing basic countries, China's chief negotiator said the 4 countries, Brazil, India, China and South Africa, spoke with one voice on the issue of climate change.
Today, the press conference of basic countries is going to send a signal to the world, to the international community, that the basic countries are united firmly in addressing climate change. We are responsible countries. We are countries of actions, and we've made achievements. We are ready to work together with all the other countries to make our due contribution to face the challenges posed by climate change.
India is participating in the negotiations in Durban in a very hopeful and a very constructive spirit, as all of us are. We are fully behind our South African hosts and valued member of the BASIC group to ensure that the Durban COP becomes successful.
The COP president says Durban is a decisive moment in trying to find a multilateral, rules-based agreement. A decisive moment in the quest to ward off devastating climate change. Renard Al-Kham, CCTV, Durban. The United Nations maintains that the COP17 talks are on track, and South Africa's chief negotiator described discussions as excellent. But many delegates are concerned. Even some who are quietly confident about these negotiations say they've already seen the effects of climate change in their countries. His Holiness Soham Baba, who's lived in caves in the Himalayas for over 20 years, planted a tree of hope at the venue of these crucial talks.
I'm very much concerned. I'm not the only one. All the ascetics, mystics in the higher altitude, those who are living in the caves, we are very much concerned because the way glaciers are melting in the Himalayas is very threatening.
Civil society organizations say they want to see a greater sense of urgency when it comes to saving the Kyoto Protocol and the Green Climate Fund to help developing nations cope with the ravages of climate change.
We are fiddling whilst Rome is burning. You know, Durban, South Africa and the entire African continent is the scene of crime. This is where the most devastating impact of globalization is felt. And people are dying here. People of Somali are looking to this conference. People of many parts of Africa where the land is being taken over by the sand dunes are looking at this conference. Here in Durban, people are dying of floods. This is east of South Africa, and Africa continent is becoming wet with floods.
We absolutely need to see Kyoto continue as the bedrock of the international fight against climate change. But that's part of a package, and it's that package that ministers have come to negotiate, and that package needs to include some signal about a future pathway to much deeper and legally binding emission reductions for everyone. And it also needs to include financing. We're going to set up the Green Climate Fund here in Durban, but we've also got to make sure that there's money to go into it.
Operationalizing the Green Climate Fund is expected to be top of the agenda until the conference ends. And as the more than 100 ministers and 12 heads of state and government continue their discussions, there's a growing air of expectation of the climate talks outcome that will be delivered here in the city of Durban, South Africa's third largest city and the biggest city on the African East Coast. Renard Al-Kham, CCTV, Durban. Negotiations continued deep into the night and into the early hours of the last official day of the United Nations climate change talks in Durban. Delegates were hard at work as time started running out. COP17 President Maite Nkoana Mashabane said she was hopeful that negotiators could make further progress in the final hours. She said parties were optimistic that the Green Climate Fund would be operationalized at these talks.
The parties are engaging genuinely and working very hard to ensure that agreement is reached on the matters before the conference. Parties are looking at convergences guided by trust and the spirit of give and take for a common goal of working together to save tomorrow today.
Nakwana Mashabane said parties were hard at work trying to ensure that agreement was reached on crucial issues on the table. This included considering the issue of the second commitment period and future process of the Kyoto Protocol, as well as the long-term finance of the Green Climate Fund.
Because parties want the Green Climate Fund to be launched here in Durban, what is being looked at now at the stage is the long-term finance, so that we do not end up launching an empty shell. But I must hasten to say that there are countries who are already lifting their flags and committing to pledges as soon as we gavel on the decision of the Green Climate Fund.
While the talks continued behind closed doors, protesters made their voices heard outside the hall where the negotiations were taking place.
We will continue to be the voice. We will continue to be the voice of the people. Of the people. All the people. All the people. And not the polluter. And not the polluter. Stand with the people. Stand with the people. Not the polluter.
We want from developed countries that they fulfill their existing obligations under the Bali Action Roadmap, and that means committing to a second commitment period immediately, also very strong emission reduction targets of at least 40%, and we need strong finances to developing world and not put the burden on developing countries like China and India.
And as negotiators cross the T's, dot the I's, and work out the best possible outcome for COP17 in Durban, protesters say they are not here to negotiate. They say they're here to demand what they call climate justice now. Renat Al-Kam, CCTV, Durban.